Welcome back. Our next panel will be a discussion around remote notary. That discussion will be moderated by Chris Holtzman, my colleague from First American Underwriting Counsel, and our panelists will include Rick Triola, founder and CEO of Notary Cam, as well as Richard Bramhall, Chief Underwriting Counsel from Westcourt Land Title Insurance Company. Take it away, Chris.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Holtzman, and today I'm happy to be joined by Richard Bramhall and Rick Triola to talk about remote online notarization. Let's just take a moment. Richard, would you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, my name is Richard Bramhall. I'm the Chief Underwriting Counsel at Westcourt Land Title Insurance Company. I'm responsible for oversight of the various state and regional underwriting counsel at Westcourt. We do business in 49 states. Alaska's still out there escaping us. And with respect to the subject of today's topic, I believe it's safe to say that we were the first underwriter to recognize the alternative and the satisfactory alternative known as remote online notarization. Have been a proponent of this industry for well over 2 years, which is nothing in comparison to Mr. Triola, who's about to introduce himself and the years that he's been involved in RON activities.
Great. Thanks. Rick, please take a minute. Introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, everybody. Thanks for having us. I appreciate it. My name is Rick Triola. I'm the founder and CEO of Notary Cam. Got to know Rich for many years as we tried to push the envelope here. But, you know, interestingly, in my background, I'm a New Yorker. I relocated to Southern California in 1999, and my mission there was to try to figure out how to do a New York closing over the internet from our California escrow offices. So if you remember, the internet was actually taken hold back in 1999. So I was a realtor. I cut my teeth on Wall Street as an investment banker, but I was a realtor. I attended all the closings. You guys know in New York, it's attorney state. Everybody's in the room at the same time. So we built a platform to allow for virtual closing for New York. So from day one, it allowed all the attorneys, the buyers, the sellers, the realtors, anybody who needed to be in that closing to attend that closing. So it's taken us a long time to get here, but we're excited to be talking to New Yorkers to get this online. Thank you.
Agreed. Thank you, Rick. And finally, my name is Chris Holtzman. I'm a vice president and underwriting counsel in First American's corporate underwriting department in Santa Ana, California. I work extensively, certainly over the past few years, on First American's underwriting strategy with respect to remote online notarizations and e-closing generally. I also started my career in New York with First American as an underwriting counsel in their National Commercial Services division. So I think it's good if we just take a moment and jump into it and really help our audience understand what we're talking about when we refer to remote online notarization. So it seems that there are several methods today to perform notarizations. So I'm going to start with a two-part question. What is remote online notarization, or RON, and how is it different from the notarization method under Governor Cuomo's executive order? Rick, do you want to start off?
Sure, happy to. So it's interesting. So remote online notarization really got started in Virginia, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, back in June of 2012. And for most of the New York attorneys, you'd be interested to know, when we did some research about this, was the impetus for the legislators to really adopt that versus an in-person e-notary was, if you remember the headlines back in those days, it was all about robo-signing, where there were nobody appearing in front of a notary. So notary seals were left on the tables. People would just get into so much volume going through, they would actually just go in and use somebody's seal and do that. So when the legislators got a hold of that remote e-notary law or in-person e-notary law, they said, why not mandate that this entire closing be recorded and video recorded? I use identity proofing to stop the fraud, to make sure that the people are who they say they are. Let's also mandate that we store that record for evidence for a minimum of 5 years. So that was the genesis of how they got around. So for us, as I mentioned, we were trying to do real estate closings online since 1999. And last mile, if you will, was the notarization, because as you know, you physically had to appear for centuries. You physically had to appear with the notary. So Virginia really changed that model. And speaking about the executive order in New York, which commonly is now known as RIN, Remote Ink Notarization, to differentiate between electronic and digital, is the order is that, a notary, so what we've done with that, actually, we worked with Richard back in April, as soon as the order came out, and we offered and we still have our concierge service, where we have the notary, the attorney/notary, meet with their clients. The documents are sent to the client physically. They have the paper documents in front of them. Through our video platform, we check the person's identity, we record the entire session, but they're actually wet signing that document in front of the attorney/notary. After they're signed, so the notary is actually witnessing them sign in wet ink, then those documents then get back to that notary, and the notary fixes the seal, and that's a legal notarization. So what we've added from Richard's point of view, and he'll talk about that from a title perspective, they wanted to make sure that we had the RON features, which is not in the executive order. So it's a higher level, a more secure transaction, because we're proving up that the signer is who they say they are, as well as recording that stuff for storage. So Rich, I don't know if there's something else you want to add about that.
Well, sure. I think probably Virginia has to be acknowledged as the source from which all remote online notary opportunity and technology originated. Although today there's RON legislation that's already of record in, I would say, over 28 states. I could be off by significant order of magnitude, but it's become very popular. The Virginia statute was followed and leveraged by companies like Rick's for several years. Shortly after that, Montana passed it, then Nevada, then Texas passed a statute which probably was most heavily involved with the MBA and the American Land Title Association, so that today what's referred to as the Model Act in large measure depends upon and derives from some of the safeguards that were built into the Texas statute. A couple of the key ingredients Rick's already mentioned for a remote online notary transaction. As the name suggests, it's done remotely. Parties are meeting each other through a virtual environment online the way we're speaking today. They're not necessarily in each other's presence, except to the extent that you can be in each other's virtual presence, although it does facilitate having one or two parties in the same place at the same time, where the overall transaction is still conducted and recorded on a virtual platform. The key features that the RON statute in general relies upon are the fact that the parties are identified both during the recorded session by satisfying the notary who participates in it that they are who they say they are. This is typically done through two means, both of which, as an underwriter, I am critically concerned about and pleased with. The first mean is called credential analysis, or government credential validation, which is a methodology where the borrower or the party whose signature is being acknowledged holds an identity card up to the camera. The image is captured and then remitted to a third-party validating entity that will effectively scan the barcode from the back of a driver's license and confirm that that does in fact correspond to the person who is representing to be the holder of said card. At the same time, there's another step called knowledge-based authentication. And this is the kind of questions that everybody who's attending this call has probably answered at one point or another when they're applying for a credit card online, where they're asked a bunch of questions in which they are to confirm what street they lived on at some point in their life, what car they owned at some point in the past, questions like that, that are dependent on knowledge that is customarily uniquely known to the person who is being asked to confirm his identity. Those two things knit together, to my mind, go a long way toward confirming the security and reliability of the authenticity of the person signing. Then you couple with that the virtual environment that meets the convenience required or necessitated due to personal circumstances. When I was first proposing and encouraging agents to appreciate and understand and embrace the whole notion of a RON transaction, I would normally point to circumstances where one of the parties to the transaction was overseas, did not have ready access to a U.S. consulate's office, and therefore wanted to find some way to facilitate getting documents executed and acknowledged without the need to go through the significant period of delay. Then another alternative method I would point out would be cases where in a large urban area, say in Greater Los Angeles and Chicagoland and all over New York, it's not necessarily convenient to get from one point of town to the other to attend a closing when you've got multiple demands on your time. People kind of got that and they appreciated that. And then last February, COVID showed up. And suddenly it was no longer difficult to explain to people just how suitable and helpful the alternative method to a conventional closing provided relief to people who really needed to get their documents executed, but did not have the wherewithal to get in front of the notary to get it done the old-fashioned way.
Very well said, Richard. A few things stick out. One, remote online notarization seems like a much more efficient process than the RIN that's permitted under Governor Cuomo's executive order, because the signing and the notarial act are happening simultaneously. It also seems like it's a fairly secure process by requiring multi-factor authentication, as opposed to simply holding one's ID up to a computer screen. Would you agree?
I would. And just to elaborate a little bit more, because some of the critics or naysayers that I dealt with, and I'm sure that Rick has had to more than his fair share of, would ask questions like, how is this superior to the traditional way in which an acknowledgement was done and how a notary's involvement is historically fulfilled? And I just think back to the number of times that I've been involved in transactions where I personally have had my signature acknowledged by a notary, and I have never, ever gone through the rigor that the remote online notary discipline requires through the government ID verification or knowledge-based authentication. If I opened the door at my house and a mobile notary walked in, he or she was pretty confident that I must be Richard Bramhall, and that was about the extent of validating my identity. So as far as the people who would suggest that this is an easily debunked process, I disagree. I think it is inherently superior to the traditional way in which IDs are fulfilled. Now, the executive order that the governor did to try and meet the demands in New York was driven by a couple of circumstances that are pretty unique to New York itself. The expectation that documents be ink signed because of the expectation in most recorders of deeds offices that there be a wet signature on a document before it's presented. Now, I know that New York does electronic notarization, and I know that New York has the Urpera statute, which would at least ostensibly represent the notion that an electronically executed document is the equivalent and equally acceptable as an ink signed document. But we're not in the business of trying to bully recorders of deeds and try and get things done that are out of custom. And that's one of the reasons why, in my opinion, the pending legislation that does at least look to verify and assure the acceptability of an electronically executed document really helps advance the cause for RON transactions in New York.
Well said. And to the point related to the pandemic, it's gone from not just being a customer convenience to sign documents without having to be physically present before a notary, but it also, in some cases, is a health measure and will help protect both the notary and the signer. So let's take a minute. Rick, Richard, you both mentioned that Virginia was really the catalyst. They were the first state to create the concept of remote online notarization, followed then by Montana, Texas, Nevada, and then several other states. So today we have well over, certainly over half of the states have permanent remote online notarization legislation. So let me ask you, where do you think we are going from here in the future? Do you think this is something that will be considered and ultimately adopted in all 50 states? Or do you think there will be some states that are a little more reluctant than others? Rick?
Yeah, if I could take that. From my experience, and Richard alluded to the pandemic, and all of a sudden, as you know, in 2019, we had 4 states that were approved RON transactions. And I just want to clarify for the audience when we say a state has approved RON, what they basically are saying is that the notaries in those states can perform remote notarizations through video conferencing technology like our platform. So we started with, First American underwriters and Richard and underwriters across the country when we first started this 8 years ago to get you to accept this concept, right? And it is, and now we're kind of like interstate recognition. So we're due to the pandemic. So where were we going in 2019 was 4 states. We started ramping up because we knew that Florida was coming on board and it was going to be another 25 states in 2020. So we started ramping up because the volume, because now the underwriters would insure those transactions. But due to the pandemic, pretty much the underwriters are we're pretty close to a 50-state solution right now. I will tell you that under the Virginia legislation, our legal counsel, when we first looked at this in 2012, we have an opinion that there are no boundaries for the Virginia notary. The signers could be anywhere in the world. And as such, we've done over 500,000 RON transactions, and they're all over the world. Last month, we did transactions in 146 countries. So it doesn't matter where the signer is, as long as the notary is licensed in that particular state. So I think where we're going is, like Richard said, all of a sudden we didn't have to explain what this is all about and the benefits of and the efficiencies and the security and stopping fraud before it occurs. I think Richard will probably talk about this, but there's federal legislation that's been pending. Of course, last year was a kind of a crazy year for anything to get anything passed in Congress, but it's sitting in front of Congress now. There's the MBA, ALTA, everybody's lobbying for a national e-notarization act, and basically that answers the final question of interstate recognition and notarial act. So, as you know, today it's well settled law for generations that if a notary in one state is notarizing a document, it's accepted everywhere else in the United States. So we're just the attorneys, and I'll let you guys talk about that, but that's the last thing that I think you want to see, that there is that interstate recognition, although underwriters like Richard will allow our RON notary from any state to notarize a document in any other state. So Richard, do you want to add some color to that?
That's a good point, because there is a distinction that has a fairly significant difference. When we talk about states that are enacting or considering RON legislation, the upshot of a state passing a RON legislation is that notaries in that state are now authorized to conduct a transaction using a remote platform, whereas before notaries had to have had to meet with the expectation that they were going to be personally face-to-face in the presence of the person whose signature they were acknowledging. So RON adoption means that a state has now authorized notaries within that state to conduct that activity. However, as Rick mentioned, there has always been, at least in many jurisdictions, the presumption of authenticity and legitimacy of the recordability of a document that was notarized in another state. And you hear terms like full faith and credit, uniform uniform recognition, that sort of thing. In fact, several states have long had on their books, and I mean for decades, something called the Uniform Recognition of Acknowledgements Act. And the Uniform Recognition of Acknowledgement Act boiled down to its key ingredients, says that if a document has been acknowledged in another state in compliance with the laws of the state where it was acknowledged, then it's eligible to be recorded and treated as if it had been executed in the state where the document is being presented to be recorded. So that's key ingredient number one. Then, as Rick pointed out, in Virginia, their Remote Online Notarization Act said that a document acknowledged before a Virginia notary is deemed to have been acknowledged in Virginia. Therefore, the intersection of those two laws, Virginia saying it happened here, and a state that has the Uniform Recognition of Acknowledgements Act saying that a document executed or acknowledged elsewhere is recordable in our state, to me, opened the door to a whole lot of states, even before they had passed their own RON legislation, that facilitated the legitimacy of recording a document that had been acknowledged in, for starters, Virginia. Now, today, that same application and same interpretation applies where you have a document notarized before a notary in any state that has passed and enabled their notaries to utilize RON technology. So that makes a big difference. You also have a couple of other uniform laws. The Uniform Electronic Transactions Act, which is a federal law that pretty much says a document that's been executed electronically is every bit as valid and subject to the same enforceability as a document that's been signed the old-fashioned way. Then you have your PRERA, which Uniform Real Property Electronic Recording Act, which says an electronically executed document is eligible to be recorded, which is one of the reasons why I'm a little bit puzzled by the reluctance of the recorders in New York State to recognize that law does give rise to the possibility of recording an electronically executed document. Nevertheless, I do believe that we're going to see a greater openness to utilizing this alternative means of doing closings. I have always maintained to my agents that it's not for everybody. Some people like going to a lawyer's office. Some people like going to the settlement agent's office. They enjoy the formality and the moment that something significant is taking place. I was a little bit surprised at the relatively modest response that we saw after we had authorized the utilization of RON transactions in several states, at the number of people who kind of, maybe some other time, they weren't necessarily all that interested in it. Another matter that I think we're going to start talking about is the question of how willing lenders are to accept RON fulfilled transactions. Initially, lenders were telling us that they were reluctant because they didn't believe they were going to be able to get a loan policy from a title underwriter. Well, then title underwriters, Westcor certainly, First American absolutely, Stewart absolutely, at least started to show a willingness to insure the transactions. Lenders still seem to be somewhat reluctant to get on board. I believe part of that is due to the fact that the ideal RON executed transaction is done using digital documents, and not all lenders have all of their loan documents reduced to an electronic platform. And as a result, they may be somewhat reluctant because it doesn't necessarily lend itself to the document set that they're currently utilizing. Now, this doesn't mean that it can't be done through RON. I mean, there are millions of transactions that could be done where you just upload a PDF of a conventionally printed document and execute it that way. But I believe that may cast some light on why some lenders continue to be a little bit slow to adopt a process that I believe is both legally and statutorily feasible. Rick, you may want to comment on acceptability among lenders.
Yeah, I think, through the years, obviously, we worked on that. Go ahead, Chris.
Rick, would you mind if I just supplemented a couple points
Sure.
that Richard mentioned before we get to the lender piece?
Sure.
I appreciate that. Thank you. So a couple of points that I wanted to make. First, the federal bill that was referenced, that is a bipartisan bill that has significant bipartisan support. And it's called the Federal Secure Act, Federal Secure Notarization Act, if you're interested in looking that up. That is one, as was mentioned, is supported by the American Land Title Association, Mortgage Bankers Association, and other industry partners. I also wanted to just take a second to give a brief update on the legislative status in our region, in New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey, because they did take slightly different approaches. In New York, as we've mentioned, when we say remote online notarization legislation, we are talking about that state granting its notaries the authority to perform remote online notarization. And New York does not have a permanent law on the books, but there are currently two bills pending before the legislature that would provide paths to remote online notarization. Additionally, in his State of the State address, Governor Cuomo did outline plans to adopt permanent remote online notarization legislation. So that is something that I know New York Land Title Association and other industry parties will continue to work with our legislators to develop a law that's safe, secure, and one that can be implemented. Connecticut is very similar. Connecticut does not have a permanent law authorizing its notaries to perform RON. But last year, a bill was introduced and it didn't make its way through the legislative process, but we do anticipate another effort this upcoming year. New Jersey took a slightly more proactive approach, I'll say. Early in the pandemic, the New Jersey legislature passed a bill that authorized its notaries to perform remote notarizations, but it was limited to the duration of the state disaster emergency. Not that we expect that to end anytime soon, but it is limited in time. But at the same time, or pretty soon after, a bill was introduced that would permanently authorize New Jersey notaries to perform RON, and that is currently very active and has had hearings in both the state Senate and Assembly. So more to come on that. Now, just turning back very quickly and talking about lender acceptance and looking at lenders in the real estate industry accepting RON. Rick, do you want to just provide an update? I know Richard touched on it, but do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, sure. Our experience with the lenders is similar to Richard's. That there's a couple of things that we knew. I think one of the misnomers about lenders is that they're not interested in this. I could say there was always interest, even pre-pandemic. There was interest in this and in finding a more efficient way for the borrowers to attend a closing and have their loan docs signed. I think there are a couple of things that we've learned through the years is that, London just needs a couple of things to happen. Obviously they need the title underwriter to ensure that transaction. They needed the comfort that the title company was going to ensure that transaction. They needed some comfort that the county recorder was going to record that document. They didn't want to put their client through this process and find out it was rejected. And one of the other things that they really needed was, especially the major lenders, was scale, right? So we found, some of these, we work with top 10 lenders across the country, and they're doing tens of thousands of transactions a month. And whether they're scanning or using paper, whatever they're doing, it works, right? It is. So for them to go off track as these states were adopting, as the technologies were evolving, to go off track to do a handful of transactions in Virginia, nobody was really excited about Virginia. There wasn't a lot of volume for lenders that run through Virginia. I could tell you then 3 years later, 2015, Montana then adopted. So we went back to those lenders and said, okay, now we got Montana. They said, don't ever talk to us about Montana. We do 3 transactions in Montana, right? So there was not the volume where they could scale, but where it really picked up, and I think the lenders, and I think you guys would agree here, is that when 2018 with Texas, when the NBA and Alta got behind the lobbying effort and really got into the statutes and wrote, participated in the legislation to make sure that the title underwriter was comfortable with this language that you could live with, all of a sudden it got the attention because now we've got Texas, and that's a big state, Nevada, right? And then we started seeing the interest come come on board, and okay, how do we do this? How do we pilot in these states? And then of course 2020 will run from 4 states to 24 states, 25 states, and then the lenders now know they need to be there because the underwriters, they've got those conditions, they've got the boxes checked. The underwriter is going to insure in 20. They were only going to insure in 4 transactions, but now they're insuring 24. So they're excited about it, and now it's just a matter of, the way the mortgage industry works. They're so swamped, they're so busy. So it's now getting the attention to get the teams involved, because it does take a team on their side. But they are definitely behind the scenes. We work with over 4,000 lenders today, and they're all behind the scenes. We are doing live transactions. They're all pilot transactions. We keep ratcheting up the amount of volume that the teams are feeling comfortable with, and working out the process and the kinks. But so definitely the lenders are. You'll see more adoption this year than ever before.
Excellent. Richard, do you have anything to add?
No, I think Rick's got his sights pretty well set on the way things should materialize. I do think that the economies of scale, now that we're over half the states with more coming and a federal legislation in the hopper, will probably get lenders a lot more focused on this. Interest rates being what they are, they're just generating stuff the old-fashioned way because demand has been absolutely nuts. Maybe if things ever cool down, it will give them a chance to repurpose some of their resources to finalizing necessary steps to better embrace, adopt, and facilitate remote online notary transactions.
And I might want to add
Yes,
here,
well
just
said.
another driver for these lenders is the fact that they're hearing it from their borrowers. They're saying, I don't want anybody coming to my house in a mobile. I don't want a mobile signing agent coming to my house. I don't want to go to an office. The notary doesn't want to meet with these people in person. So they're really frantically, even though they're swamped with demand, their teams that are all teed up trying to figure this out and get a solution out to those borrowers that want that social distancing safety.
That's great. We certainly have the technology available, so it's good to see that on the lender end of the spectrum that they are working towards adoption. Finally, I thought it would be good to discuss how, and Rick, I'm going to throw this one to you first, given that you founded a RON platform, NotaryCam. How do title agents or independent title closers that are notaries and title agents who have notaries on staff, how do they actually go about getting onboarded with a RON vendor once their state has passed a law?
Yeah, great question. So in our model, because I came from the real estate world, I'm not, you could tell by my age, I'm not a techie, but I just knew I wanted to simplify this. It was, like I mentioned earlier, New York process, so complicated, so many people I had to coordinate and how to get realtors and everybody in the room at the same time. So it's basically, so we have 2 models. One's a service, for example, where, again, using the New York model, we know that the attorneys need to be in that closing. So we have a platform that the attorneys, I joke with my friend New York attorneys back east and say, listen, you could do these closings from the golf course or the beach, right? You can be anywhere. You don't have to be in that office any longer. But basically, it's a platform like you're looking at today where all people attend and everybody's walking through the documents. The documents are front facing. Everybody's talking through the documents. Attorneys, clients are asking questions, and you can mark it up and do all the things that you do. So that's a service model that doesn't take any training there. But to your point, when New York allows for New York RON notaries, the adoption of RON notaries by New York notaries, is that we have a training process. We help our attorney / notaries on board with the state. There's a couple of things you need to do. Usually it requires a digital certificate, which tamper seals the document, which we'll get in another show. But and then create the stamp, the electronic digital stamp that gets affixed to the document. And so we help onboard the notaries onboard and through our Notary Cam Academy. So we have a Notary Cam Academy that trains everybody on our platform. We help the notary get onboarded, and we train them as well. And since we're 24/7, 365, we're always in there with the sessions with the new notaries to make sure we there to troubleshoot any camera issues or technology issues that they may not be familiar with.
That's great. Richard, from a title insurance perspective, what do you recommend that title agents think about or prepare for when a RON law is passed in their state?
Well, of course, if a RON law is passed in a given agent's state, then they can look forward to the opportunity to get their own notaries qualified, depending on whatever the necessary criteria might be in that state's law. They still need to take advantage of a platform, and that's where a company like Notary Cam fits in, because it's not going to be a Zoom call. It's not going to be a FaceTime transaction. It's going to be hosted in a secure environment with limited access. And that's the sort of thing that Rick and his team put together painstakingly over years. So the agent has two things they need to do. They need to get their notaries made eligible. If there's an additional electronic notary requirement in the statute, they need to get themselves comfortable with a platform that provides the necessary environment. Possibly they're going to need to utilize the platform to take advantage of the knowledge-based authentication question generator, as well as the government ID credential validator, which are commercially available, but not just something that you get by dialing 1-800-ID. So there are going to be two steps involved. Get your notary qualified and get yourself connected with a platform that provides and hosts the service.
That's great. Thank you so much, both of you, for taking time out of your schedules to be here today. Do you have anything that you'd like to say in closing?
No, I appreciate everyone's time and attention, and would be more than happy to answer one-off questions as they come in.
Yeah, ditto. Thanks for having us. It's great. You know, this is my home state. I'm so excited to see New York finally jump in here. I know it matters. You know, there's a lot of people that will enjoy this process in New York. Thank you.
Well said. I agree. Thank you, everyone.